such a bad image. So we want to call ourselves something else, and they call themselves a place for learning. And you see this phrase, a place for learning, popping up in all kind of places as well. Also in professional education, higher education, and maybe also in Google Hangout on the web. There are also these virtual places for learning. There is a problem here. I'll show you the problem in a minute. This is not in itself an argument against learning, although my book was called Against Learning, but it's an argument that tries to make something visible about the limitations of learning as an educational language. So that's the point I'm trying to make. But later on this afternoon we may have opportunity to go a bit further into that. This is one way in which I try to capture the problem. I do that by saying that for me the point of education is not that children or students learn. And by education I mean something quite specific. I mean that we spend time and energy and money to bring people together in a building or a particular setting with the aim that education happens. When we do that, I think it's not enough to say that what should happen there is that the children or the students learn. I'd rather say, and this is maybe the subtle difference, but for me I think it's an important difference. In education, I think the point is always that students learn something, that they learn it for a purpose, and that they learn it from someone. And these three aspects, the content and the purpose and the relationships, are for me three educational questions that we always need to ask when we organize something, bring people together, or as a society say to children, you have to go to that setting or that building or that institution for the next 10 years of your life. Then we need to engage with the question, what is it about, what is it for, and what are the particular relationships that happen there. My problem with the language of learning is that that language often leads us away from asking these questions. I see that a lot in research on education, particular research that tries to assess the impact of some kind of educational strategy. And very often I read the paper that says we wanted to assess the impact of this on student learning. And if that's all, then for me, in a sense, things are already lost, because I think student learning is not precise enough. And I'll try to give a bit more precision a little later. But when you just think of examples of where we use the word learning, like learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning the second law of thermodynamics, which is quite an interesting law, learning to ride the bicycle, learning to be patient, learning that you're actually not good at something. In all this we use the word learning, but it refers to very different dynamics, very different results, very different processes. This for me is a limitation already of the word learning, that it's just not precise enough. So the language of learning, you can say, runs the danger of not being a helpful language if we need to talk in education. That's my concern. That's why I've referred to that development with the word learnification, which doesn't exist in English and sounds like a problematic or an ugly word, and that's intended there. Of these three, content, purpose, and relationships, my point is, and I'm not claiming that this is a deep point, that the question of purpose is the central and fundamental question. Because if we can't articulate what it is we want to achieve with our students, if we can't articulate what we want our students to achieve, we have no criterion to decide what content matters there, nor have we got a criterion about how to use relationships in an educative way. So of the three, for me it starts with the question of purpose. And then there is something interesting, which I believe we as educators should really be very explicit about, because for me it shows something about the complexity and the difficulty of education as a job that is unlike any other field of work. So I would claim, but don't quote me on this, that teaching actually is one of the most difficult jobs because of a very specific complexity. And I'll show something about where this complexity comes back. It starts again with quite a simple observation that when we are engaging in educational activities, we never work only in one dimension, but we are actually impacting on a number of dimensions. And in the way in which I have tried to conceptualize that, I make a distinction between three domains in which educational activities have influence, impact, or significance. You can say education is always about something. Even this talk is about something. So there are always questions of knowledge and skills involved in education. Teachers, curricula offer knowledge and skills, students get knowledge and skills. Through that, students become qualified to do something. You can think of professional qualifications or becoming qualified to live in a complex Western society. So this dimension, which is known in the literature, is often referred to as the qualification dimension of education. If that was the only thing that we needed to take care of in education, our job would be easy, maybe. At least we would only need to take care of one dimension. The point I'm making here is that there are two other dimensions that are also at play, and therefore we also need to take care of those. One dimension is one that in the literature is known as socialization, and this has to do with the way in which traditions come into play. The way in which we represent traditions and the way in which we invite students to take position in those traditions or become part of those traditions. We do an awful lot of that in primary and secondary school, presenting our society, our world in a particular way. It also happens very explicitly in professional education, where we try to engage students with particular ways of being a professional. And these are quite clear and confined. So that's another dimension in which we work. And I think it's always also there. There is a conservative idea of schools that says schools are just institutions for the transmission of knowledge. But even if you only say this is what we do, then you are already communicating a particular view about the school, a particular view about knowledge, a particular view about teaching. So that's always there as well. And then I would say there is a third dimension where you can say very quickly, education also impacts on the person. It either limits people's possibilities or it widens their possibilities, for the good or for the worse. I think people who know of Bildungs traditions or Donald's traditions know that this is an important part of education as well. In my own work, I've used the concept of subjectification to talk about that, and in it you find the word subject, which is a more philosophical way to talk about the person or the human being. I have a particular reason for it because there is something nice in the word subject. It not only means that we are sort of the origin of actions, but subject also means to be subjected to something else. And I'll say a little later why that is important as well. So this simply starts from looking at education and saying what are sort of the potential impacts. They are in these three domains, I would claim. And then I would say if this is what happens as soon as a teacher opens her mouth or as soon as we open a textbook, then as educators we need to take responsibility for these three domains. So there are three functions of education. We can analyze how education functions in these three domains. But I also call them three domains of purpose, three areas in which we always need to ask what is it that we want to achieve and what we want our students to achieve. Looking at my watch, there's a small detail here about this word subjectification, because some people like what I say here, and then they say, oh, with this third dimension, subjectification, you mean identity. For people who thought that that's what I meant, identity for me has to do with the domain of socialization. Because for me, identity is the question, who am I? Which is a question we always answer in relation to existing traditions, either to say, I am part of that tradition, or I distinguish myself from that tradition. Subjectification, the question of subjectness, is the question, how am I? It's the question, how we exist. Independent, dependent, autonomous and critical, compassionate. So it's a different set of qualities. That's what I have in mind here. But this is a detail. Out of this, you can draw a very simple picture about education and its domains of purpose. I like to do it in a Venn diagram because we can distinguish these three domains, but we cannot really separate them. So for me, real education